Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the officiating of this past weekend. It was really bad. There's no two ways to put it. It was very, very bad and something that just has to be fixed in the sport because it definitely can be, and for some reason we just haven't yet. But let's get into some winners and some losers from week 3. Hopefully we don't have to talk about officiating anymore on this show, but we'll see. Definitely something that could pop up throughout the season. But crazy week 3. A ton of things happened, a couple of upsets here and there from group of 5 teams, but overall the top teams kind of took care of business for the most part. So going to be an interesting group, but let's get into this. And the Miami fans have to be having the best year of their lives. They're walking into this season, they knew they had all this hype, they knew they had all this energy, but I think there was a part of them that was just a little bit wary. I think there was part of them that was sitting there saying, okay, feel really good about this season, feel really confident in this team, but we got to make sure we're ready to go. We got to make sure that everything comes into place, and I don't want to get too excited before they get on the field. Then they go up to Gainesville, Florida, absolutely body bag the Florida Gators, and they're going crazy, which is part of this as well. But you have a huge win to start your season, then you've taken care of business the last couple of weeks, and during that time, the two people that you recruit against the most, Florida and Florida State, have been burning. They've been all over the place. Florida obviously is going likely to have to undergo a coaching change here pretty soon. We'll see what happens on that. Obviously has not happened yet, but I expect it to happen here pretty soon. And then you have Florida State, isn't necessarily going through a coaching change, but is definitely going through some form of rebuild there. So Miami's just kind of hanging out. Miami's just kind of in a position where they can dominate recruiting in Florida for the vast majority of the next couple of years. They have the ability where if Florida doesn't get the next hire right, they're sitting pretty for quite some time. And on top of that, they're in a conference with Florida State where Florida State gets all the attention of being the, one suing the conference and being the one that's struggling after a great year and all this stuff. They're just hanging out and executing football and doing exactly what they wanted to do this upcoming season, but it came as well with a little bit of not so good fortune for their opponent. So they very much like what they're seeing on the football field from their team, but also absolutely love what they're seeing from Tallahassee and Gainesville right about now. But the loser was the SEC. The SEC's had a very interesting year thus far where A&M falls to Notre Dame at home, and then Notre Dame takes a terrible loss to NIU, or Texas beats Michigan at Michigan, and then Michigan looks benign the next week, and we'll talk about that game here in a second. But Vanderbilt is the team that this week really took the world by storm, losing to Georgia State, and then Mississippi State obviously getting torn apart by Toledo for much of that game. On top of that, you had terrible officiating around the conference in Columbia, South Carolina, as well as a number of other places, and then UGA kind of struggling, your top dog all over the place. So the SEC's just kind of had a weird year. They're kind of all over the place. You never really can't really get a beat on who's great, who's not. I mean, feel pretty good saying Texas and Ole Miss are great, but other than that, I think there's a lot of question marks in that conference, and there's a lot of teams that just aren't playing quite as crisp football as you would like right now. So the SEC is fine. There's plenty of teams that are playing really good football right about now, but as of right now, they're not necessarily quite as deep top to bottom as they usually are. Moving forward, the winners are the teams that actually found themselves, the teams that were able to figure out what was going on and figure out to get on the right path, and Oregon is the best example of this. They were explosive, they ran the ball for 240 yards, the O-line was a million times better, all of the stuff that we've talked about through the first couple of weeks. Oregon did exactly that on Saturday. It was absolutely incredible to watch, kind of unlocked what we thought Oregon was going to be this upcoming year, and likely will be reflected in my top 12 later. But the reality is, really impressive performance from this group. And then another was maybe A&M, maybe Notre Dame found a little bit of something in their identity of their offense that could possibly kickstart them into the next era of this season, get a really good thing rolling for both those teams. And then you had teams that moved in the opposite direction, like Georgia and a couple others, and those would definitely be losers. But Oregon absolutely found their stride this weekend. I don't expect it to stop anytime soon. Losers were especially home SEC teams. They had a very, very tough week. There were 3 conference SEC games this past weekend. The away team won all of them. Georgia went into Kentucky and got a big-time win. LSU went to South Carolina, got a big-time win. And then A&M just rolled the Gators in the swamp. So a lot of things that were happening in the SEC that don't normally happen. Now, a lot of these, Kentucky especially, was taking them to the wire a little bit tougher, probably because they were at home and probably because that played a factor in the game, but not coming out on the winning side of that, obviously obviously does hurt quite a bit. I think A&M especially made this very, very known. That crowd was not a factor, and frankly, I do not blame them. I think at this point, when you see you're down 21-0 or 21-6, I can't exactly remember, at halftime to a backup quarterback, I don't know if I would throw my energy behind that team either. So I'm not necessarily going after Florida fans, but that's the reality. We had a number of different things that happened throughout this week, and Georgia and LSU came into Kentucky and South Carolina and kind of ruined a couple of rush the field scenarios in those, especially at South Carolina, which just don't go down to the field before the game is over. Just a general rule of thumb, just don't tempt fate that way. But at the end of the day, a very, very big day for a couple of away SEC teams. Some of them escaping some home atmospheres, no doubt about it. But at the end of the day, we're able to get some wins in some very tough atmospheres, including Florida and South Carolina. And then you have some winners. The group of five did really, really well. The group of five had a great weekend. It made things a little bit more complicated, no doubt about that, trying to figure out who the group of five team is going to be at the end of the day. But I do think it's a very interesting conversation. You had three of them that played Power 4 opponents and got wins, and they got paid to do it. So very, very nice time to be a group of five opponent. You had Toledo absolutely taking Mississippi State to the woodshed, probably the wildest thing I saw all weekend. And then you had Memphis going to Tallahassee and frankly not even play their best football and beat Florida State there. And then you had Georgia State get the finish of the weekend. You had UNLV went to Kansas, and got a win over the Jayhawks. So many different things that happened in the group of five that definitely make it more complicated to figure out who that last team is going to be at the end of the day. It's one of those that is going to be tough to figure out, but I think there's a number of really good candidates. I think you could go to Boise State if you really wanted to. That might be the best team, but probably haven't played the best football right about now. And then you have Memphis, you have UNLV, you have NIU, you have a million different teams that are absolutely going to have something to say about this, and I have no beat on it. I'll be totally honest with you. I don't know if Washington State and Oregon State are included in that, but if they are, maybe Washington State could be that group. I don't think they are if I am remembering correctly, but very, very interesting what's going on in the group of five, and frankly, I think it's going to be very tough to get a beat on the rest of the year. I'll be totally honest with you. The loser was most of us, I'll be totally honest with you. When we were watching this past weekend, there were a lot of really, really fun games. There were upsets, there were a couple of momentum turns, there were elite performances, there were new stars emerging like Arch Manning and all of these people, but the reality is, when you're watching these games, it was really hard to not be mad at the officiating. It was really hard to sit there and say, I'm really enjoying this game, I absolutely love everything that's going on, without also saying, but the refs are getting a little bit too much involved. The LSU South Carolina game was one of the best games of the year, probably the best game of the year up until this point. The refs were a big part of that, and that's not something that you ever want to happen. It's never something that you really want to get involved in, is this game is being decided by the guys that are the zebras, essentially, that are deciding this game. So you got to be able to figure out a way to fix this. We talked about it in the last segment, so I won't waste too much more time here, but I have to imagine this was a shared feeling. I have to imagine everyone was watching in. Some benefit more than others, so maybe some aren't necessarily yelling quite as loud, but I do think it was kind of a bad Saturday in terms of officiating. It's always a good Saturday when college football is on, but the reality is it felt like every game that I was watching, there were a couple of calls that made me scratch my head and made me just a little bit angry, and I never want to be that way on college football Saturday. So it was a bad day for officiating, no two ways about it. Hopefully we get a little bit better this upcoming weekend, and it's not quite as frustrating, but we'll see what happens, and hopefully we're on the winner side of this next weekend. Winners is anyone with UGA on their schedule. This UGA team finally showed weakness. They showed a little bit of an opening that you possibly can exploit. This O-line is not on the level that it needs to be. If they're going to go into Tuscaloosa with that O-line in 2 weeks, they're going to lose. I can absolutely promise you that. If they're going to go to Austin in a couple of weeks with that O-line, they're going to lose. Now, the good news is they have 14 days to figure out all of the different things they have to fix and get that O-line in the better place. So it's not necessarily all that bad of a thing, but the O-line was not all that great on Saturday. The run game was bad right now. The offensive play calling was all over the place. It just really wasn't UGA football. They've had a number of different games throughout the last couple of years that have looked clunky, that have looked a little bit all over the place, but they always seem to look better than this. This Saturday looked a little bit different than the other ones, but at the end of the day, I think when you can see someone like that, when you can see a little crack in the armor, it makes you feel a little bit more confident. It doesn't necessarily mean you have a better shot of beating them, but it does mean when they walk into your stadium, you at least believe that you can beat them, and that means the world. But the other part of this is they know this, and they also know what's possible when this team gets that type of energy, and they know the other part of all of this, which means, yes, teams with UGA on their schedule are losers in this weekend because Kirby Smart got exactly what he needed. They did not want to be number one in the AP poll, I can promise you that. They very badly wanted to be number 2 or number 3 so they could definitely flex their muscles just a little bit and definitely use that as bait because Kirby Smart is one of the best motivators in the sport. That does not need to be said. Everyone understands that. He just needs a little bit of food. He just needs a little bit of bait to get his boys going, to get his boys running, and then it's going to be a problem. So we gave it to them. They officially have it. That bad Kentucky performance gave them a little bit of an opening. Texas is now on top of them in the rankings, and Kirby gets to use that for the next 13 days. And then we'll see what happens in Tuscaloosa. But the reality is I'm having a hard time saying this UGA team is just outright bad now, or this UGA team is attackable, or they're going to lose to Alabama. I'm more on the other side. I think I'm more on the losers than the winners. I will say, seeing them struggle the way they did gives you a lot more confidence going into that one. But on the other side of that, you have a coach and a team in general that is going to thrive off this, that is going to take this and probably shove it down a lot of people's throat throughout the year. But we'll see what happens on this one. Obviously, a ton of winners and losers from this past weekend, and I think the people that have UGA on their schedule somehow fit into both groups. I think you feel a little bit more confidence because you saw the guy get a little bit of crack in his armor, but you also know what's on the other side of that, which is Kirby Smart just reaming these guys out for the next 13 days and likely being really ready to go in Tuscaloosa. But let's take our second break here. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit about the other games that we didn't have a chance to get to yesterday. Just a couple of games, some blowouts, some not, that definitely want to get on y'all's radar because there were some really interesting things that happened in them. But we'll break it down right after this, so stick with us.